Okay, so hello and welcome. Many thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Mike Wendt. I'm the program director at Woodland Pattern Book Center in Milwaukee, here where I'm broadcasting from. We're thrilled to celebrate the publication of We Will Always Be Here, a guide to understanding the history of LGBTQ activism in Wisconsin, with authors Jenny Kalvaitis, Kristen Whitson, along with teen panelists. Just so excited for this, and thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to begin by saying we acknowledge that in Milwaukee, we live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami, part of North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We further acknowledge the grave evil colonialism introduced to these lands through genocide, as well as slavery, but also via racist and xenophobic beliefs, laws, and practices that continue to inflict harm upon Black, Brown, and Indigenous lives. We honor those who have lived and do live now at these intersections of identity and experience and are committed to the active dismantling of white supremacy. So many thanks again to you all. Thank you to Jenny and Kristen and our team panelists. I also want to thank everyone who helped spread the word and make this event possible. So Chris, Caldwell, and all at Wisconsin Historical Society Press, as well as Vince Trippy and everyone at Milwaukee Pride, Wes Shaver, and everyone at Milwaukee Pride. And you'll hear from some of these folks in just a moment, but I just would be remiss to not thank everybody. For anyone who isn't unfamiliar, to say just a little bit about Woodland Pattern. We're a nonprofit literary arts organization based in Milwaukee's River West neighborhood, where we've been for more than 40 years. We host a variety of events each year, including readings, film screenings, workshops, and reading and writing groups, as well as facilitating after school and summer programming in poetry and the arts through our youth literary arts program. We're now open for browsing in the bookstore, which is relatively recent, just the past couple of weeks. So I hope you'll come visit us if you're comfortable doing that. We're open from 12 to 7, Tuesday through Sunday, and closed Mondays. Speaking of the book center, I do want to share a link and say that We Will Always Be Here is for sale at Woodland through Woodland Pattern. So here's a link to our online store in the chat. In particular, a link directly to the book, but then you can from there browse the online store. But again, if you feel comfortable doing so and are in the area, come on in and pick up a copy in person. We would love to see you. And then just a quick rundown of the Zoom logistics for the event. So for this event, we'd be grateful if you'd keep video turned off and audio muted. Thank you for that. There will be some time for questions after the presentations, and we would love to field your questions through the chat. So as of now, it's open publicly to everyone, so you can chat to everyone at once. And that is the best way for us to field those questions. I will say that you should please feel free to post those questions in the chat throughout at any point. And in fact, that would be helpful. If you have a question, even in the middle of things, then we can sort of go back and have hopefully a stockpile of questions to run through and for Jenny, Kristen, and the teen panelists to answer. I think that about covers the Zoom logistics. So with that, I'm really happy to turn things over now to Vince Trippy of Milwaukee Pride. Welcome and thank you, Vince, for being here and for all.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Vince Trippy. I'm the Director of Outreach and Education for Milwaukee Pride. And oh my goodness, I love this kind of stuff. We are very good friends with Woodland Pattern and Wisconsin Historical Society. Previously, we've hosted talks by Dick Wagner, who also features heavily in the text, and hosted other events at Woodland Pattern. So this is so great to bring two groups of friends together that like they just it's great. The synergies are wonderful. As I was reading this text, I was just enthralled by how it's not only focused on young people, but also on our local environment, our state, the place that is our home. Because as I run the history exhibit at Pride Fest in years when we don't have pandemics, hopefully we'll have more of those. I'm just amazed at how little knowledge there is around our history as queer people. And I'm so excited for such an accessible text to be available to people now. And I can't wait to help promote it in every possible way that I can. Some things that I'd really like to lift up that Milwaukee Pride is also doing. We're working on raising visibility for and lifting voices of communities in southeastern Wisconsin by we helped to make sure that everything went smoothly for the Black Lives Matter March for Pride, as well as the big gay bus that's driving around town with the Milwaukee County Transit and downtown Milwaukee. I know that there's been a lot of real excitement around those representations of visibility, and I think that it really matters to show that we're here and we will always be here. One other thing I'd like to just plug, if I may, is at pridefest.com, we are hosting our digital health and wellness area. Every year we have a space specifically devoted to health and wellness oriented organizations, and we are now bringing that year round for free. So there's plenty of service providers, and I encourage everyone to tap those resources as they find they would be useful to them in their lives. Thank you so much for writing this book, Jenny and Chris. I cannot stop gushing. I'm just gushing all over the place. So at that point, I should hand it over to Chris for some closing remarks from the press.
Thank you, and I just want to thank Michael and everyone at Woodland Pattern and Vince and everyone at Milwaukee Pride for co-hosting tonight. And I want to thank you out in the audience for joining us for this Pride celebration and this celebration of the new book, We Will Always Be Here. I'm Chris Caldwell from WHS Press, part of the Wisconsin Historical Society, which has been collecting, preserving, and sharing the stories of our state for 175 years. In 2019 and 2020, the press was honored to be able to share two groundbreaking volumes on gay history by R. Richard Wagner. We've been here all along, Wisconsin's early gay history, and coming out moving forward, Wisconsin's recent gay history. And we realized pretty early on in the process that the history highlighted in those two books would have enormous relevance to an audience of teens who will be writing the next chapter of our state's history. So we turned to an absolute dream team of co-authors to tell the story of Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus change makers, storytellers, and visionaries with a teen audience in mind. Jenny Kelvidis, who has a master's degree in public history and over a decade's worth of experience in informal education and museum education, and Kristen Whitson with a master's degree in library and information studies and a deep background in digital, community, and LGBTQ plus archives. In We Will Always Be Here, they uncover the longstanding and rich history of LGBTQ plus activism in Wisconsin, sharing the voices and stories of pioneers who left an indelible mark on our state. They powerfully demonstrate that the study of history not only informs our sense of self and allows us to make sense of the present, but also offers us inspiration as we shape the future. And they offer a powerful reminder to LGBTQ plus readers and allies that they're not alone and that they never have been. They stand on the shoulders of generations of ordinary, extraordinary LGBTQ plus people who have called our state home. The result's a book that will encourage teens to explore the past and also to tell their own stories. And that's why we're so very lucky tonight to be joined by two outstanding panelists to lend their own perspective on the book. We'll be meeting them in just a bit. But first, please join me in welcoming authors Jenny Kalvaitis and Kristen Whitson.
Oh my gosh, you guys, it's here. So I recognize lots and lots of the names here. So thank you all so much for being here. My mom is here. My mother-in-law is here. Lots of friends and family, and some names I don't recognize too. So welcome. We're so excited to tell you all about the book. We're excited to tell you about some of the history and a little bit about ourselves too. But before we get started, we want to take a moment to thank the Wisconsin Historical Society. I know this first several minutes has all been like a bunch of thank yous, but we really need to thank the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, particularly the press director, Kate Thompson, our editor, Liz Wyckoff, and the marketing team of Kristen Gilpatrick, Chris Caldwell, and Bridget Billing. The WHS Press has really put their weight, their expertise, their leadership, and their guidance behind this book and these initiatives. And we're so grateful to be a part of this effort with them. Personally, we also want our families to know how grateful we are for your support and encouragement. None of this would be possible without the villages that have formed around us of our friends and family. So thank you for being here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going today. Jenny, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. We're going to tell you a little bit about how this particular book came about, and then why this source material, why now. We will dive into some of those sources, sharing one source per chapter with you, and we'll read a little bit from each chapter. We're going to hear from our teen panelists who will share with us their reflections and contributions. And then after that, we'll talk about where we go from here, and we will gladly take some questions at the end. And I will also say that Mike from Woodland Pattern is going to be monitoring the chat. And so if you have questions that occur to you while we're talking, please feel free to type them in, and we will get to them probably at the end.
So we'll go ahead and get started. And really, we wanted to start by saying, people that we would identify today as being part of the LGBTQ community, or people who would have identified as part of the community, have lived in Wisconsin for as long as there have been people who've lived on this land. It's just that older sources are harder to find. And in fact, to this day, sources can be hard to find. But we know that there is a genuine interest among our youth to know these stories. And I know that personally, anecdotally, because I've spent over a decade judging a contest called National History Day. And every year, consistently, students choose topics on LGBTQ history to explore and research themselves because they don't know those stories. Things like Stonewall, the Lavender Menace, the Well appear each and every year. So generations of people have been fighting to know these stories, but luckily all of that is changing here in Wisconsin. And it really started because of Dick Wagner, who's pictured here in the 2-volume series that Chris mentioned as well. Really, Wagner is the best person to have written this definitive history of LGBTQ Wisconsin. He lived much of the history that he shares in the 2nd volume. He has a PhD in history, and he was involved in Wisconsin politics for decades. So the things that he collected really allowed a lot of this work to happen. And it truly was an outgrowth of the desire of his donors and the groups that got together that we were going to have a teen outreach piece. So when the Wisconsin Historical Society turned to me as the coordinator of secondary education and asked, what are we going to do? I quickly looked around and looked at what was happening, of course, as best practice in social studies classrooms across the nation, as well as across Wisconsin. And we very quickly settled on a primary source volume that was going to be rooted in looking at the historical activism of the LGBTQ community, and then also make sure that we have a really strong teen voice. A few years back, working with a group actually in Milwaukee called Urban Underground, I picked up this phrase that I absolutely love, which is nothing about us without us. And that is so incredibly important when talking about any group's histories that we're telling, but also especially important when we're talking about our audience and who we're trying to tell these stories to. So teenagers are going to be part of our co-writers, our curators, really choosing what we are going to share. And their words appear throughout the book. You can see one of the blurbs that we have here on the screen, kind of guiding us along on what we're going to include in the book. And thankfully, just as I was starting to look up at the mountain of this project and feel a little overwhelmed, the amazing Kristen, Whitson, and I, we connected at a conference, and she agreed to work on this amazing project with me. And her amazing archival expertise, especially in this area, and my educational background, I think combined to create just the perfect partnership in order to write this book. So the backbone, the spine of our project is really what we call the spectrum of activism. And our book is thematic in approach and really is broken down by these 5 chapters. And we use the phrase spectrum of activism for a few different reasons. It works, I think, really well bringing in the association of spectrums or rainbows with an LGBTQ history book, but also the reality of activism like identities, that there's no 2 forms of activism that are alike, that our activism is fluid just as our identities can be and are throughout our lives. So there's ways that we kind of move within these different themes of activism on a daily basis, an hourly basis, and kind of explore them. But ultimately, there's no sense in judging one form of activism as better or harder than another, because truly, even being true to yourself can be the most courageous thing that you could do, because it can bring legal action or physical attacks coming at you. And ultimately, too, we do know that activism has been and is a loaded term that makes some people nervous. But the reality is that the form of activism that we're talking about is really things that we choose to do on a daily basis. If this morning you woke up and you clicked on a news link to learn more about a specific topic that you saw come across your screen, that is a form of activism. You took a purposeful action to educate yourself further. And that's really what we mean by talking about our spectrum of activism and what educate yourself can mean. So we chose stories, well, I shouldn't say we, along with teens, right? This royal we, the we that you can't even see on your screen right now, chose stories to fit within this thematic structure and then break down Wisconsin history in this way. And I do really mean that the teens helped us choose, because I jokingly say my favorite source actually didn't even appear in the book. I love this source that is this sash from a Central Wisconsin drag show that says Miss Guernsey on it. And I think it's incredibly iconic and hilarious coming from Wisconsin, because it says Miss Guernsey, but it has a Holstein patterning on it. And if you know your Wisconsin dairy history, you know both the Guernsey and the Holstein are iconic Wisconsin cows. But you know, our teens, it just didn't fit with their cross sections of identities to find that cow history quite as fascinating as I did, perhaps. So it didn't make it in the book, but amazing sources did. Each chapter contains 5 to 7 primary sources. So we tell 5 to 7 distinct stories in each chapter, and they cover over 100 years of history and crisscross the state of Wisconsin. And we are going to share just a few of those stories with you now.
So first on our list of types of activism is, in chapter 1, educating yourself. And I'm going to kind of switch back and forth between reading here from the book and then adding a little bit of explanation for our audience. So this is how the chapter begins. What we learn shapes us into the people we become. We are taught by our teachers, families, and friends, but we must also take our education into our own hands and seek out topics that matter to us. This is especially true of topics that don't normally come up in classrooms or casual conversations. The simple act of reading about people like yourself can be incredibly powerful. The sources here in chapter 1 demonstrate how information about the LGBTQ+ community can awaken, educate, and inspire in different ways. So in 1972, the magazine The Ladder ran a small news item with the headline, "2 Black Women Seek Marriage License." Remember, 1972 was really early in the fight for equal rights for LGBTQ+ folks, just a few years after Stonewall and decades before the fight for marriage equality would really take shape. Donna Burkett and Minonia Evans of Milwaukee argued that they were missing out on tax benefits by not being allowed to marry. They eventually lost their court case and were not able to marry legally, but they did have a church ceremony. That brief article in the latter magazine surely had a profound impact on many of the magazine's readers, which by 1972 had 4,000 subscribers. Some of those readers may have remembered this article 44 years later in 2015, when same-sex marriage finally became legal in all 50 states. You'll also see here on the screen a little screenshot from one of the book pages. So this is what the primary sources look like in the book itself, and we try to give you an image of what those look like on the slides to come so that you can see what it looks like on the page. We also really wanted to give our teen readers sort of a look and feel of what a primary source would look like.
So our next chapter is Tell Your Story. And like Kristen, I'll read from the book and then add a little commentary as well. So telling your story can start with reflections in a journal or a diary. Lou Sullivan was a transgender gay man born in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin in 1951. During his youth, he dreamed of becoming a writer. At the age of 11, he began recording his life in a pink vinyl diary. In his early journal entries, Sullivan recorded his feelings, observations, and desires. He noted that he played boys as an 11-year-old. He explored his identity on the page long before he ever told anyone about feeling like a man trapped inside a woman's body. Journaling is a very personal form of writing, and most journals are not intended to be shared. Often people who journal find it valuable to look back and reflect on the thoughts of their younger selves. Journals can act as time capsules, recording who you were and how you felt at pivotal moments in your life. In this book, we included entries from when Sullivan was 15, 16, and 19 years old, respectively. He continued to write a diary until his death from AIDS in 1991. And Lou Sullivan started by exploring his gender and sexuality by writing in a diary, and he ended up becoming one of the first publicly gay trans men to medically transition. Included in the book is one entry that we put within the book written by Sullivan on March 10th, 1967. And what he wrote was, "I thought of the days when I really thought I was a cowboy. I dressed the part and I really was one. I don't have to dress up anymore and I'm glad. The cowboy is in my soul where he counts. He doesn't have a name because he's 1,000 different men. Always men though. I really should have been a boy. I'd be so much happier as a boy. I'd probably make a good marriage because my husband will be me in all that I want for myself. I'll treat him as though he were me. Strange." Our next chapter then is Be True to Yourself. And what we wrote in the introduction was, we can never truly know what it feels like to be someone else. But as you read the primary sources in this chapter, we challenge you to try seeing yourself in the world through another person's eyes. Imagine how you might have felt in their shoes. We hope these stories embolden you to take action by expressing your own identity. Sometimes being true to yourself is the most courageous thing you can do. In rural Wisconsin, two men went into business together so they could live life on their own terms. Robert Bob Neal and Edgar Hullum created a world for themselves in Mineral Point, Wisconsin in the 1930s. They opened a renowned restaurant and worked to save the Cornish buildings and history of the area. Their historically preserved houses and built landscape, known collectively as Pendarvis, are now part of the Wisconsin Historical Society. But before Bob and Edgar found each other and lived together as business and life partners, they forged their own paths as gay men in the early 1900s. Included in the book and here on the screen is the first letter sent from Edgar to Bob after they met in 1934. Although we don't know the exact events of the weekend that Edgar mentions, it's clear that they had quite a lot of fun together. The following summer, Bob and Edgar bought Pendarvis House for $10 and embarked on an adventure that would last for decades.
So chapter 4 talks about building community. Communities can be big or small, public or private, formal or informal. And throughout Wisconsin history, LGBTQ+ folks have formed a wide range of communities in order to protect, educate, and support one another. Lysistrata was a feminist cooperative in Madison. It ran a restaurant, bar, and performance space from 1977 to 1982. By providing a multi-purpose space for meeting, socializing, and entertaining, Lysistrata became a central gathering place for Madison's feminist community, which included queer women as well as feminists of all genders. The excerpt in the book is from an early brochure produced by the Lysistrata Cooperative. Members of the cooperative were trying to raise funds for the restaurant and lounge. And after they'd raised enough money, Lysistrata opened with a bang on New Year's Eve in 1977. It was an open, airy restaurant by day, serving lunch crowds with a select menu. And at night, the bar opened and patrons danced the night away. The Madison Fire Departments and Police Departments both came to Lysistrata to recruit their first women officers and firefighters in the late 70s. The co-op was never completely financially stable. The group wanted to provide customers with affordable prices, but it never made enough money to cover the daily operations. So around 1980, Lysistrata's founders began seeking other ways to support the co-op. They made appeals to their shareholders for more donations and even considered selling the operation. Lysistrata was set to be sold, although the paperwork had not yet been signed, when the building burned down on January 8th, 1982. It was such a cold day that the firefighters couldn't use the water hoses to douse the flames. Lysistrata board members were cleared of any wrongdoing, but the cause of the fire was never determined. Lysistrata's community mourned and still mourns the loss of this feminist oasis. Finally, in chapter 5, we talk about getting active. People create change by actively supporting or opposing issues of their time. And this chapter provides examples of actions that affected real change in Wisconsin's LGBTQ+ community. Almost no other event in LGBTQ+ history has motivated more individuals to take action than the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s. This public health crisis resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States and many more around the world. The LGBTQ+ community was devastated by this infectious disease and blamed for it in many cases, especially in the early years of the epidemic, when many believed that only gay people and drug users were affected. Some LGBTQ+ people with HIV or AIDS were outed without their permission when hospitals called their families and revealed their diagnoses. Some patients' families were not supportive of their sexual orientation and did not allow patients' partners and friends to visit them in the hospital while they were dying. These tragic experiences were recalled in legal battles decades later when gay people fought to gain marriage rights. So now that two people can be considered legal spouses, regardless of their gender, they cannot be barred from visiting one another in hospital rooms. The AIDS epidemic encouraged LGBTQ+ people and their loved ones to become active in many ways. Some worked to memorialize those who had died, to ensure that the tragedy of the global epidemic would not be lost to history. In 1987, a group of strangers in San Francisco started the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. The quilt was a traveling memorial to those who had lost their lives to AIDS-related illnesses, and each square of the quilt was designed and created by friends, partners, and families to commemorate their loved ones. The quilt is made up of more than 48,000 squares, just one of which is pictured here, from when the parts of the quilt visited Madison. If displayed in whole, the quilt would be roughly the size of the city of Sheboygan, Wisconsin in 2020. Portions of the quilt have been displayed in Madison and in Milwaukee. So, as Jenny said in the beginning, activism takes many forms and spans a spectrum of ways of making change. The LGBTQ+ people, allies, and activists we read and wrote about in this book changed the world by educating themselves, by telling their own stories, by being true to themselves, by building communities, and by getting active. These people made their own contributions to a larger movement. Over the decades, their efforts have added up to significant changes in this state and beyond. Today, same-sex marriage is legal in Wisconsin and around the United States. Legal protections in housing, jobs, restaurants, and businesses for LGBTQ+ people are much more common than they were 50 years ago. And in fact, attitudes about gay rights have changed faster than attitudes about almost any other social issue in the history of the United States. Our goal with this book was to educate teens on Wisconsin's unique LGBTQ+ history, both the good and the bad. We wanted teens to see how Wisconsin was at the forefront of the gay rights movement when it passed the first non-discrimination law in the country in 1982. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ+ people have existed here on this land, going all the way back to the Two-Spirit people among the Ho-Chunk, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ+ people are still here today and always will be.
Our youth are powerful and resilient, and this book truly is meant to celebrate their identities and give them a knowledge of their history that they continue to write today. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce our first panelist, Cora, who is a student at a small public school in rural Wisconsin. Cora uses the pronouns she and her and is an active member of the LGBTQ community. Cora looks forward to her senior year and can't wait for GSA, Gender Sexuality Alliance, and Science Olympiad. Cora prides herself on competing in state-level competitions, whether that be in music or academic decathlon. She also loves to play with her dog and raise chickens. And now I'll hand this over to you, Cora.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. First off, I would like to thank Jenny and Kristen for letting me speak here today. I would definitely not be here if it wasn't for them and them being the amazing human beings that they are. So I guess you are all wondering, who am I and why am I here? I'll start with the question, who am I? It's probably going to be one of the harder questions I'm asking myself today. When I first hear the question, who am I, or who are you, I would answer that I'm a bag of flesh holding some blood and bones, possibly some important organs. Although I do understand that not everyone likes those answers, and some people would say who they are based on the things they're involved in. Like, hi, I'm Cora. I go to a public high school and I like music. Or things they've done in the past. Like, hi, I'm Cora, and one time I walked into a poll. So, who am I? Well, I'm Cora, as I said before. I'm a high schooler working a minimum wage job at a grocery store, and I have walked into a poll before. I would also say that I'm human, a human being trying to figure out how the space rock works. Now I should answer, why am I here? Well, to start at the beginning, I was once part of an advisory council for the Wisconsin Historical Society. Jenny was the leader at the time, so we worked together at least once a month until COVID-19 struck and the team was disbanded. In March of 2020, I was sent a survey by Jenny asking for teens to look over primary sources and give my thoughts on each passage. One that really spoke out to me was one about Ralph Carino, a young man being ridiculed for who he was. A trans man. Now, personally, I am not part of the trans community, but I do understand what it is like being ridiculed for being who you are, whether that be at school, work, or just out in the world. Jenny must have really liked my comments because soon enough, she sent me an email about some book called We Will Always Be Here. I don't know what it is. She started explaining it was about the LGBTQ community and their history in Wisconsin. Jenny asked if I would like to work on the project sometime again, and I obviously said yes. So what I did on this project was, over the course of summer 2020, I worked with Jenny by reading portions of the book and attending many meetings about what I thought. Soon after a couple of said meetings, I was invited to a documentary team with another teenager around my age. On the documentary team, I got to talk about what I did in the book, plus my thoughts on certain things within the book. For example, fixing a slight mistake, To go back to Ralph Carino, while reading the book before another meeting, I noticed a mistake. They accidentally dead named Ralph outside of the primary source. If you don't know what dead naming is the use of birth or other former name without the person's consent. Dead naming can cause a lot of dysphoria and is very disrespectful to the person. So during the meeting of Jenny and Kristen, as soon as I had the chance, I quickly told them about dead naming and how it was very disrespectful to him. Luckily, it wasn't too late to be changed and Ralph Carino's legacy wasn't tarnished. So why is it important to read this book? This book is important because it shines a light on how the LGBTQ+ community has grown throughout Wisconsin history. Hitting key points such as Ralph Carino being arrested in 1914, Donna Burkett and Mononia Evans trying to obtain a marriage license in 1972, and in 1992, Bi Shy Y being founded. So who am I and why am I here? Well, I'm Cora, and I'm not just here to help sell the book, but also to tell you my story, fixing mistakes, educating myself, and how this book inspired me to be active and get me where I am today. We Will Always Be Here provides a chance for you to educate yourself, tell your story, be true to you, build a community, and finally get active.
Thank you so much, Cora. And Cora's contribution about the dead naming was one of many, many important contributions that we got from our teen panelists. And one of many, many reasons it was so important for us to include their voices in this process. So thank you, Cora. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next teen panelist. Che, or Chayton, is currently a high schooler in an urban city in Wisconsin. His pronouns are he, him, his. It is my privilege to have met Che through his work in theater. He's extremely grateful to have grown up in a family full of members in the LGBTQ community. He's ecstatic to be part of this amazing team and wants to give a special thanks to his family. He hopes he can do justice for the individuals mentioned in this book when he reenacts a primary source that appears in the book. Che,
Hey everyone, my name is Chayton, or Che for short. Before I begin, I just want to give a really special thanks to the team and the co-authors for putting together just this amazing book and this even better team. I am just, so grateful to have this opportunity and to be a part of this project. So as Kristen mentioned, I do have a very vibrant family full of members who are in the LGBTQ community. So I have 2 gay grandmas, I have 2 siblings that are part of the LGBTQ+ community, and I even have a bi step parent. So, I have had just the absolute privilege to grow up around these people and to see their strength and their perseverance. And so I'm just very lucky and very thankful to, grow up around this amazing community. As Kristen also mentioned, she has seen me in a couple of my productions. I do theater. I've done it for the past 5-ish years, and I've always loved it. So Kristen has seen a couple of my productions, and when she was co-writing this book, she came to me, and through my acting experience, she asked me if she wanted me to sort of revisit some of these primary sources. And, I just fell in love with that idea. I thought that was super cool and super just such a smart idea. So I had to read through the book and I had to look over the primary sources. And so when I read over the book, there were 2 things that really stood out to me that I just really loved about the book. And the first one was I felt the diction choice was just amazing. It was very to the point. It was honestly a very easy read. And I was always on track. There was never a point where I was confused or didn't know what was going on. And any point that I may have, or I could have been confused, there was always definitions for any of the words that I wouldn't know. So for example, Cora said dead naming. And in case I didn't know what that meant, there was definitions for all sorts of those words. So that was the first thing that I really liked about the book. Very easy read and very understandable. The second thing that I really loved about this book was just how humanizing it was. In my history class or in other classes, when we have to read primary sources, I'd often find myself getting, very lost. I wouldn't be able to connect with the person. I wouldn't know really who they were. But when reading this book, I felt the authors did an amazing job at just contextualizing these people and their lives and their stories, I felt like I knew them. You know, I felt like I could be walking down the street and I could just see them and I could walk up to them and meet them. So they did a really, really good job at, you know, making me feel like they're real people, because they are. So that being said, when reading through the book, I chose a piece between Ted Pierce and Willard Motley, who grew up in the 20th century, and they exchanged letters for over 27 years, which is just so cool. So they were both part of the LGBTQ community. Specifically, they were both gay. And the reason why they were writing back and forth was Ted Pierce created a safe space for gay men, because oftentimes during the 50s, you could get arrested or you could face repercussions for being openly homosexual. So that was really cool for Ted's view. So that being said, I'm going to read one of the letters between or from Willard Motley to Ted Pierce. Dear Ted, just a note to say how good it was to see you and to see Madison again. The trip to the States would not have been successful and filled with perfumed memories without these two fulfillments. Yes, it was a rushed visit and a crazy start of Motley Circus, then descended, but I'm looking forward to the time when you can come to Mexico for, say, 2 weeks, when we can leisurely sit and talk and look at all the wonderful things here, and I can show you Mexico through my eyes and my fingertips. I know it will happen someday, and I know you will never want to go north of the border once having been here. Looking forward to the showing of Mexico to you with almost a demon's delight. Write to me, and remember that a bedroom awaits you here at my house in Mexico. And tonight, after you read my letter, look at Madison for me, at the campus, at the lake, at all the beautiful things there, and remember that a part of me lives there in Madison. As ever, will not. So that was one of the many primary sources within the book, and I fell in love with all of them. They're all super amazing. So that was just another thing that I really loved about the book. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. Really bringing that to life, and I love the way that you gave life to Motley's letter. Thank you for sharing your insights, and this has just been absolutely fabulous. I am going to just share my screen one last time so that we can show you a little bit about what is next, because we wrote the book, but then of course there's always more. So we are currently working on an educational resource that will be ready in the fall. And that educational resource is designed for both kind of organizational club use. So any GSAFE or library reading group, lots of discussion questions and critical thinking questions. And then also, if you are a teacher, we have some examples of maybe some assessments that might work well, or activities, classroom activities. So that is forthcoming. We also are now honored to be working on a traveling exhibit that will hopefully be going into high schools and colleges across the state on similar topics, although not exactly the same as the book. And that's expected to be ready in the winter of 2022. And then Kristen and I are, of course, doing lots of talks and events. We've got things booked out all the way into June of 2022 as well, so a year out already. So if you have any interest in bringing us to any local libraries or anything in your area, we would love to connect with teens and adults across the state. And then, of course, we also have a social media presence, and you can follow us on Facebook or reach out to us at any time. Here is our contact information. We'd love to hear, what you thought about the book, what you thought about the launch, other things that you think we could do to take this project even further. We are just so touched about how of an amazing reception it's been getting, and thankful for voices like Chay's and Cora's, who have been part of this process and also just part of this conversation as we bring it out into the world. And now we are ready. If there are any questions or comments, we would love to turn this into a conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you so much. This was just like amazing, and yeah, really just wonderful to be able to host this, and grateful to you all. There are some questions. This is wonderful. So one that sort of follows on what you were just talking about, right? What's next, Jenny? This book is a phenomenal resource. This is from Anna. This book is a phenomenal resource and inspiration for LGBTQ+ teens, but also for creating understanding and empathetic allies now and in the future. Do you hope this will become part of school curriculums?
Sure, so I can go first, then Kristen, you can jump in as well. So I will say that when we started this journey, probably about 2.5 years ago, we had a very serious conversation about, you know, if it was just going to be a curriculum that was going to go right into classrooms. But we do recognize that for some classrooms and some communities, this could be a controversial need. So we have really targeted the idea of kind of after school clubs like GSAFE or GSAs across Wisconsin, as well as really thinking about the teens themselves who can pick up the book. We would love if it was adopted into curriculum across the state. As we mentioned, you know, it is aligned to best standards for social studies standards across Wisconsin. So we have hope that maybe one day we will definitely have some curriculum adoptions across the state. But we don't have any that we know of quite yet, but there's a lot of communities out there.
We're also kind of focusing on school librarians or for teachers who just have the book available in their classroom, even if they're not teaching it specifically. And those are the folks for whom that educational resource guide could possibly be pretty helpful, is to give them a way to guide teens' thinking as they're reading the book. I personally have heard from school librarians and from teachers at several different grade levels, you know, like upper middle school and high school grade levels, who have said that they plan to just have the book available for teens who they think would particularly benefit from it. So that's the answer on that.
Oh, and one more thing to add. We did also think about, I mentioned in the talk itself, the program National History Day, which is assigned in classrooms across Wisconsin. There's like, I don't know, 15,000 students that generally participate each year. And so we thought about kind of the way that that book could assist in that project as well that might be assigned.
Please feel free to let your local school district know about the book, and then they can decide what they would like to do with it.
Thanks for that, and great question. And that sort of answers Chris's question as well about getting the book into schools. Here's hoping, right? One from Stephanie. Great book. Thank you for sharing these materials with teens. Where did you find the letters, photos, etc.? And how did you select the specific items for the book?
That's a fantastic question. Thanks for asking it, Stephanie. I'll answer the how did you find the letters, photos, etc., and then I'll let Jenny talk about the selection process a little bit more. So part of the reason that this partnership works so well is because one of us knows how to talk to and get information from teens, and the other one of us is an archivist working in LGBTQ+ archives. And so one of my coworkers at the time is actually still on the call, Tyler. Hi, Tyler. And I was working at the Madison LGBTQ+ archive, which is housed at the UW-Madison University archives. So that's where some of the sources came from. Like, I just happened to be working with them, so I knew that they existed. Some of them we knew about from both mine and Jenny's work with the Wisconsin Historical Society. So for instance, that letter at Pendarvis was collected by a colleague of Jenny's who alerted us to its existence, and we could include that. Some of the sources we found digitally, which is actually not super common. Not everybody knows this, but most archival materials are not digitized. But we actually had to do a fair amount of the writing and research after the pandemic started, when archival reading rooms had closed. And so a lot of it we had to rely on digital materials, which is just one more reason why digitized materials can be really helpful, you know, in the wider community. So I think I answered that question pretty thoroughly. It was a combination of methods of how we found the materials. Some of it was stuff we knew, some of it was stuff we went looking for. And then we very carefully selected the sources to hit a range of identities, intersectionalities. We wanted representation from urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas, all over the state. In the very back of the book, there's a map of where all of our sources came from, because it was really important to us that teens could look at the map and find a source that was close to them geographically. We wanted a range of genders, ethnicities, ages. So we tried to hit all those high points. Then once we had all of our sources, Jenny.
Sure. So Kristen compiled this amazing thing, and then we used the organizational board of like a Trello to keep everything in track. And it was quite the undertaking, to be honest, especially for Kristen, who did the heavy lifting there. And then what we planned in order to kind of choose which of those sources were going to rise to the top, because we certainly had way too many. This book would have been 10 times as long. We were going to go into classrooms across Wisconsin and partner with GSAFE or GSAs, and had reached out to a couple different schools, had planned some pizza parties, and had planned some kind of conversations that we were going to have with teens. And then it was March of 2020 and none of that happened. We also were going to present at the GSAFE conference, and that didn't happen either. Everything was just kind of canceled. So Kristen and I quickly pivoted, and we then launched the surveys that Cora mentioned. So taking kind of that long list of primary sources, building in some context to help give direction to the teens, and then working with GSAFE, working with some networks that we'd already had and existed, and working with some teachers, tried to get that survey out there as wide as we could, and had 5 different surveys for each of the chapters to really kind of hone in on what spoke the most to teens, what was most relevant, what was most powerful to today. We wanted to make sure that we didn't just choose our primary sources and what we thought should be inspirational and celebrational, but instead really kind of dive into that teen mentality. And then you can see throughout the book, even where in the presentation, where we included some of the verbiage that Cora mentioned from filling out that survey, and then digging a little bit deeper from there. So it kind of became this kind of communal project to choose what was going to end up being in the book. And it was a really rewarding process, and really amazing with some of the insightful answers we had from those teen surveys.
That's great, thank you. And again, thanks for the great question. And I'm going to stick to just reading questions, but I also want to point out that there are some wonderful comments too, and suggestions for places to place the book, which is wonderful. As for questions, I think there are 2 sitting here that I feel like are maybe kind of related, if tangentially. So there's one that's from Vicky. Will there be a volume 2? Are there additional stories you hope to share? Which is great. And then I think maybe slightly related from Stephanie, in the future, would you ever write another book after asking teens to submit their stories? Perhaps there's some convergence there. Great questions, thank you.
Jenny, I can start, and then you can. This is how we work in the media interviews and all the stuff that we've been asked to do. We just sort of pick a direction, and one of us will start and the other one finishes. Usually when I run out of words and they start jumbling together, then Jenny jumps in and saves me. There were a lot of stories that we really loved that were left on the cutting room floor, as Jenny said. And I don't know that there will be another book. I think it's a great idea. There's no plans for it. Really the direction I think we wanted to go with the stories that were left on the cutting room floor, or the stories that are still happening now, to Stephanie's point about collecting teens' stories that are happening right now. There are so many other ways to go than a book. So the traveling exhibit that Jenny mentioned is another way to get those stories out there. The educational resource guide, PBS Wisconsin is still now working on a documentary of Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history. And our dream, in our spare time, is that we would love to have a really interactive website or web resource that then can share things like videos or interactive maps, or what we would call like digital humanities kinds of things, like you can click on a spot on the map and it'll take you to an oral history and you can hear from somebody, and then you can see like, pictures of events and, all kinds of interlinked things. And so I think that might be the direction that we go more with future stories. I will say I would write another book with Jenny in a heartbeat. So nothing's off the table.
And that feeling is mutual, Kristen. So I think too, just to kind of go off of more what Kristen was saying, we do have that traveling exhibit that we're currently working on. And just like we did with the book, we're reaching out to teens to get stories and to include that in the traveling exhibit, which is really focusing right now on kind of community building. And then too, there's more conversations about additional exhibits with the Wisconsin Historical Society that they're still kind of figuring out what that is going to look like. But you are completely correct. There are so many stories and so many, amazing things to tell in this world that there could be 10 books and we wouldn't capture everybody's story. The other thing too is that I love this idea of having a book about teens' voice and capture them. That's actually one of the primary sources that we include in the book. Is there was a book that was published called 2 and 20 in the 1990s, and we have the story of Jennifer Hanahan in the book because she partook in this 2 and 20 kind of memoir writing, as a young person, capturing this moment in time, and has this amazing story that actually I think hands down was the most popular source among our teens when rating what should be in the book, because it was just so personal and so relatable, and captured this moment in time in this teen transition year just so very well.
Thank you so much. And I lied, I do want to read one comment because there's one from Anna that, 100% yes. Cora and Chayton, thank you so much for being here and helping to shape this book. You are both such great presenters and confident in yourselves. So yes, wonderful. And then I also, so there's a question here from Vince, and maybe instead of me reading it, I'll just, Vince, do you want to ask your question? Do you want to jump into the conversation and ask your question, Vince? What do you think?
Should we tell him that his mic is muted? I know, I did it earlier.
Yes, you should.
Too.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So something I didn't say about myself earlier is I have a certificate in LGBT studies from UW-Milwaukee, which is not a thing that exists everywhere, but I super encourage people to do it. One of the things we had to do in that program was do primary source research. And one of the super cool things that I got to do was read through GPU News, which is the Gay People's Union newsletter in Milwaukee. And I actually have like archival bound edition that I got in a library sale one time. It was actually like the hand calligraphied copy that was given to Eldon Murray, apparently, which is super special. Anyway, so in this 1971 edition, they have that Donna Burkett story where they went to go get married, and it's super striking to me when I read modern political stories. I remember back when Ogerberger-Fell, the gay marriage case, went through, and Justice John Roberts was like, well, this gay marriage issue, it's all very new. It's so new. And this is like in black and white from 1971. And I was wondering, like, for teen panelists, like, did these things that you read about in these primary sources, whether it's people who nowadays might identify as transgender or same-sex marriages, even if they weren't pursued through legal means, like, were those new ideas to you, or did you have an inkling that people like us have always been around, kind of thing?
Yeah, so I can answer this one first. I think unfortunately a lot of school curriculums all around the country have very much neglected the like vast and vibrant like history of the LGBTQ plus community. And when talking to even to my parents and how they grew up and just sort of the different conversation around the LGBTQ plus community, I do think that it was more of a taboo subject. However, I feel like I don't think that's an excuse whatsoever to like name these as new sort of ideas or new, yeah, like as you stated, new modern ideas. I think that's a very closed mindset. So I think unfortunately there's a lot of reform that needs to happen within the school system. So that way I can learn more about it, because this was sort of my first more in-depth read on the history of LGBTQ, the LGBTQ plus community. So I did not have a lot of background knowledge before reading this book, which is unfortunate, but that does not give anyone the excuse to say, well, these people don't deserve rights because I don't know about them. Like, so yeah, that would be my answer.
Yeah, to add on about the education and stuff, luckily my school is very accepting. Like we have a GSA. I'm from like a small town, country living. Luckily our school lets us have a GSA, and they also let our GSA come into classrooms and help, teach people about like some brief history, like brief, like what's happening in today's world without being too political. And we also teach about pronouns and identities and all of that. But prior to me being in GSA my freshman year, I knew LGBTQ plus people existed, but I didn't know. Like, they're not new, but I didn't know when people started talking about them, which is very unfortunate, because after reading this book, I was like mind blown about all these people and all their stories.
Yeah, I think that's a really relatable experience where, like a lot of people when they're in maybe smaller communities or insular communities, maybe you go to a parochial school or something like that, and you're like, I have these feelings, I have these experiences, and I'm the only person in the entire world like me. And then all of a sudden you maybe you come out, or you find one other person, you're like, holy cow, there's this whole other world out there.
I will also just jump in and say we have done one person in-person event, which was amazing and miraculous. We had a ton of different teens who came up and talked to us. But one of them in particular, I remember just kind of incredulously asking, how do you even know these stories? Like, how do you know this? And that was pretty telling and amazing, right? And I think that is hopefully one of the things that this book will start to do, is that it'll be easier to just pick up and find, rather than having kind of this uncertain discovery path of where you find stories like this for teenagers. So we're really excited because we had so much energy coming from that teen demographic of like, there's a book like this and you wrote it? Like, that's crazy. So it was pretty amazing.
Thanks so much for jumping in, Vince. And of course, thank you, Jay and Cora, for answering that question. So we've got one more here in the chat, and perhaps this might be the note on which we wrap it up. But so Jenny mentioned a moment, this is from Christina. Jenny mentioned a moment ago a source that was the most popular among the teen respondents. Were there any sources that surprised you in the responses generated, ones that you were expecting to be more popular or well received that weren't, or ones that you were expecting to be, you weren't expecting to, but were, right?
I can just answer with mine quickly. I have kind of a short answer. And I have talked about this before in a couple of different areas. I thought that kids in high school were learning more about the AIDS epidemic than they were. So I am, my wife has 2 children and 2 teenagers actually, who I sometimes shamelessly talk to my stepchildren about ideas for this book, because I had teenagers in my house while I was writing a book for teenagers, so it was super handy. And I asked our oldest, who was 18 at the time, I asked her, do you learn about AIDS in school? And she said, only in health class. They don't learn about the history, they don't learn about the social impact or the impact on the LGBTQ plus community. They don't learn about any of that stuff. And so I was pleased to see in the surveys that we sent out to the teens that several of them said about the sources that were about HIV/AIDS epidemic, that they were curious and interested and wanted to learn more. I wasn't really surprised, but I was glad to see that they said, oh my gosh, I had no idea, and that they wanted to learn more. So I think that was one of my takeaways from that process. What about you, Jenny?
Yeah, I think that there was a number of insightful comments that came through. The other thing that we occasionally did was we got a little bit tricky in the way that we could include multiple sources through kind of the similar story. So for example, we could talk about Our Lives magazine, and then we focus on a specific issue of Our Lives magazine that would allow us to tell a story that didn't get chosen by the teens that was as relatable to them as much. So we're able to kind of put in some more in each source in a way sometimes to keep our favorites. And like I said, you know, my favorite source of the Miss Guernsey sash with the Holstein patterning didn't get 1 vote, which was a little devastating in my heart. But that's okay, because it was about what they really wanted to see in the book. And we did, you know, have a number of sources too that I think probably like the sash if we would have had that in-person conversation, and I probably would have swayed that actually then. So maybe it's better that we didn't have that in-person conversation, you know, but I think that in-person versus that reading of it really probably also had an impact on what made it through, but probably for the best, because of the way that the book doesn't have additional interpretation like the survey. It is that kind of reading experience to have. So there were some really, you know, amazing things that made it through that were crazy popular. Like I said, Jennifer Haranahan was really popular. I think that's the one that really sticks in my mind. Do you remember what else was really popular, Kristen?
Lou Sullivan was super popular.
Yes.
But like, I think teens were astonished to learn that there was a transgender person in the 1970s. And I think they were even more astonished to find out there were transgender people. There have been transgender people as long as there have been people, but they were really surprised to read about Ralph Carwinio, you know, in 1914. So
it's true. Ralph Carwinio, like Cora said, and maybe Cora can also mention as well, was one of the really popular sources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Ralph Carwinio, when I read that story, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. Like, there was someone in 1914. I was just mind blown over that, because unfortunately, due to education, current education anyway, we don't really get much history. To touch base on the AIDS epidemic, no clue about it, didn't learn about it, never heard of it really. Luckily, I'm very interested in learning about history, so I am learning about all these things. Like Stonewall, didn't hear about it till about last year when I did a report on it. Just, I'd never heard about these things, and luckily with this book, I am finally educating myself about this, and I can start talking and sharing this.
Yeah, just quickly adding on to what everyone else has said, I've had very similar experiences. I even went to New York like 2 or 3 years back, and we went to the actual we went to the actual building, and I remember being there, and everyone else was like, oh yeah, that's Stonewall, and I was like, I have no idea what this place is, which just like gives you a sense of like how little they actually teach stuff like in school. And also just a side note I'd like to add is, I think something, because I read a couple of these primary sources to a couple of my friends in the LGBTQ plus community. I think something that surprised me in their responses was just how how much they related to them, even though they were decades ago. Like one of them I'll name was, there was a woman who was bisexual talking about how, I don't remember her name, sorry, but she was talking about how every day it was sort of like a battle figuring out, was she actually a lesbian or was she just straight? Like she was always sort of dealing with that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've literally had conversations with my friends where they've like, who are bisexual, who have like said this exact same thing. And this was written, you know, decades ago. And so I showed it to them and I just thought it was super cool how they were like, oh my gosh, I like completely relate to that. So even though, you know, it's decades apart, you know, they shared similar experiences. So I think that was something that surprised me, because I feel like in my head, I just sort of felt like, oh, you know, it happened a while ago. Maybe the experiences are different, but no, still share a lot of stuff together.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, I just want to, a huge thank you, Jenny and Kristen, Cora, Che. It's been an incredible pleasure to celebrate the launch of this book. Really, we're all so grateful at Woodland Pattern, and of course, again to Vince and Chris and everyone at Milwaukee Pride and Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Just amazing. Thank you. And to everybody who's joined us here this evening. Really incredible.
I want to make sure that George knows that I want to answer their question, which was, are there any Native American stories before much contact with Europeans? And I know we're trying to wrap up, but it's an important question that I don't want to ignore. So a couple of things super quickly. One is that we didn't feel comfortable trying to tell those stories ourselves because we're two white people. And this wasn't the kind of project that we could go talk to Native American communities or Indigenous communities to get those stories in order to include them in the book. So we make sure to include several different Indigenous, sometimes Two-Spirit, sometimes not Two-Spirit people and stories in the book. But I also want to point you at an Indigenous person, a Two-Spirit Ojibwe person who is doing this work, whose name is Kai, and who is also involved in that PBS Wisconsin documentary. Kai has a bunch of really great information out there, and it is more appropriate for an Indigenous person to be gathering those stories, I think, than it is for us to do that. So I just wanted to make sure to answer that question really quickly. And please feel free to email us or connect with us on our Facebook page if you have more questions or comments. Yes, and the 2021 Northwoods Pride celebration. Is that this weekend, Vince?
It is the 26th. There's actually going to be, I think, like a 4-hour webinar, or one of the webinars has a Two-Spirit Anishinaabe artist who's going to be speaking. And so Nicolay College is up in Rhinelander, if you don't know. So that's, yeah, that's an area that we're seeing a lot more discourse around, and a lot more Two-Spirit individuals sharing their stories and their histories.
Yep. We did make sure to include Two-Spirit perspectives, sources in the book, but it's not pre-European contact, to answer your question really directly. So, but thank you for asking it. Thank you everybody so much for being here. I'm sorry to cut off the end with answering another question, but that's how it goes.
No, thank you for answering the question. That was wonderful. Yeah, amazing resource that you shared in the chat. And likewise, Vince. Okay.
All right.
Again, thank you all. Good night. And
thank you. Happy Pride.
Yay. Bye.